So just firstly, I am going to go through exactly what, this is just a repeat of what I just said, so we'll just go to the next slide. What we'll look at first is how the release structure is organised. So firstly, our release structure is broken into major releases. They go out every 6 months, and we have minor releases, and they go out every few weeks. Often as regular as every week, sometimes they're every couple of weeks, but they're just on demand, as necessary. So they fix bugs, they do small changes, they're non-threatening, you don't really need to worry too much about them, they will just go out. But the major release part, should actually have a slide up there that shows this. The major release part is the bit that's scary. That's the bit where we put all the new features and new functions. They go into that big major release. So up here on the board you can see an example of major being 16.5. We use what's called SEMVAR. So 16 is actually the year 2016. 17 is the year as well. And then we have two major releases, 0.0 for the first half of the year and 0.5 for the second half of the year. It's not incredibly complicated, just to give you some background behind those numbers. And in between those we have lots of point releases. So we just finished off 16.5.33. So we did 33 point releases to the 16.5 series. So there's a lot of small patches that go out. In that there might be a dozen bug fixes each point release. Generally we find that they start off fairly frequently at the beginning of a release, and then over time they slow down and they start to become less frequent towards the end of the release. We only support one major release at a time. So what that means is there's a very little overlap between the two. So you can see up on this screen, let me see if I've got a little pointer here. No? No laser pointer. But up there on the screen you see 16.5 ends and 17 starts. So there's actually no overlap between the two. Okay? So that's obviously a challenge for people, that we get this situation where we stop supporting version 16.5 and we start supporting version 17 the moment version 17 goes live, which has just happened, of course. Sometimes we do make exceptions to that rule. For example, we did just do 16.5.3.3 after we released 17. We did that because there was a critical issue that we needed to fix in 16.5.3.3, and that's really the only time that we would do that type of point release on an old reason. If there was some critical, absolutely major issue that needed to be resolved, we will do point releases, but other than that we won't be doing any more bug fixes to that 16.5 series. Okay. I should note that generally our minor releases are automatically deployed, so you probably won't even know that they're happening, but they are happening. And for those that are looking, you can always tell what point release you're on by looking in the footer of your Schoolbox. So down the very bottom of your Schoolbox instance, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there will be a little version number in the bottom there that will tell you what version your school is currently running. So if you ever need to check up and see, have we got this update, where are we at with our updates, I just got this information from Schoolbox about version 17, what version are we running, you can always check down there in the footer. The major releases, however, are not automatically updated. So we need you to initiate that update process. So you need to come to us and say, we would like to upgrade to version 17. So it won't automatically happen. It is actually something you need to engage us to do. So I guess that means that there is a level of responsibility on you to actually perform that action, and you need to understand what the consequences of that action are and what you need to do before you call us up and say update. So the first big question is, when do I update? Okay, so when should I, how long after version 17 goes live should I wait before I initiate the update? So there's a couple of parts to that question. The time between the time between those two, there we go, will determine a few things. So firstly, when a new release comes out, there'll be no new bug fixes for that past release. So this leaves you exposed to any bugs during that period. So the period between the red lines, you won't be, if you're on the old version, you won't be getting any bug fixes in that period of time. So you need to understand that you're exposed to almost a lack of patches coming through. So if you call up the support line and say, I've got this bug, can you fix it? It wouldn't be uncommon for us to say, oh yeah, we've actually already fixed that. It was fixed in version 17.01, but you're running 16.5. So to get that, you're going to need to update. So just be aware that the longer you leave that upgrade process, the less bug fixes you're going to be receiving during that time. The other side of the coin is if you update too early, you may expose yourself to unforeseen issues. And so it takes a bit of work to make sure you're prepared for those. So just the sort of unforeseen issues that you typically could be exposed to. Generally, we're pretty good on getting things all tested for what our standard test cases are. But there are cases where, for example, you have custom development, you might have customizations for your particular school, you might have specific requirements in your environment, and they may all expose you to bugs that we couldn't see before we did the update. So it's really important that you think about what potential risks upgrading brings with it as well. We also recognise that different organisations have a different risk profile, different process. Some are more conservative and would like to, leave updates longer, slower, and that's fine, but just do that with the idea that it will expose you to a longer period without bug fixes or new features. One of the other things, when it comes to actually performing this update, picking the actual time that you do the update is really important. So it's not just about how long, but also what time you do it. We always recommend to customers that you do upgrades during business hours. The reason behind that is that everyone's there to fix it if something goes wrong. If we do an update outside of business hours on a weekend, and we have to call you up on the weekend to say, oh yeah, something went wrong with the update, can you help us out? I don't think you'll be very impressed. So we always want to keep these updates during business hours. The other thing about that is that we often find that outside of business hours is actually Schoolbox's busiest period of usage. So the most common time we actually get asked for is, can you update it at 5 or 6 o'clock at night? That actually happens to be the busiest time for most Schoolbox instances. And so picking a time maybe during lunchtime is generally the lowest usage point for upgrades. So we always recommend getting your upgrade done probably around lunchtime or in the middle of the day sometime, just to make sure that there's people around. If something goes wrong, we've always got someone there to fix it up. On both sides, I guess, because things can go wrong on both sides. What else have I got? Look, just in general, and from a general perspective of how long you should leave it between updates, I mean, I would expect most schools would have upgraded within 3 months of a release going gold. So I mean, we've got a 6-month release cycle. If you've taken half of that to update, it's sort of starting to push it. If you're taking longer, you then expose yourself to even more risks. New features, bigger change, a whole lot of other problems start to come on. So I always do recommend keeping those updates within 3 months of going gold. So generally somewhere between 2 weeks after going gold and 3 months would be the general time frame with which to set and update your server. Just on the other side, with the update process internally, we actually have a staggered release process. What the staggering of the release process does is ensure that we're not rolling out an update to every school on one day. We will only update a certain amount of schools every day, and that ensures that if there is some critical issue that is discovered during that update process, we're minimising the amount of customers impacted by that update. So we're trying to roll out updates slowly over time rather than just rolling it out across everyone in a split second and then having some great disaster affect every school. But if we only roll it out to 2 or 3 customers and then we find it, we've minimised that impact. So just be aware that we also have some internal quotas as well around how we roll out updates, just to make sure we're not increasing the risk for your side. Okay. Now, next up, I'm just going to talk about how to actually manage the change and minimise the disruption of the change. Firstly, we provide a whole variety of resources, but what generally happens when we do an update is there's a whole lot of new features, new functions, changes in the system, and one thing that we've learned over many releases is that teachers can be surprised by that change. Okay, so you roll out something new, worst case scenario, they're horrified at that change. Best case scenario, they may not even notice it, and then they're not making use of that new feature or new function. So with that, we've decided to build a whole lot of resources and extra materials available so that you can communicate and manage that change process. So on our help centre, there's a whole lot of resources up there that are there to support you in updating to the new releases. Just some examples up there. Obviously, the version 17 changes for teachers. That guide is specifically designed to tell teachers what impacts the update will have on them for that particular use case. There's also the release notes, of course, that we send out. They're more specific for, general IT to consume and see all the changes within the system, but that teacher's document is specifically for teachers in teacher language. We also have an article on major release change management tips. So that goes into more detail than what I'm talking about today in terms of how to actually manage the release, roll it out, communicate, strategies on how to communicate, those sort of things as well. So I do recommend having a look over that document to get more detail following this session about how to manage the release change. Of course, having teachers trained up on the software is also a good way to minimise the disruption from change. So we have our teacher course. It's now updated to 16.5 and 17 technologies. So it's now working to teach teachers about the latest features and functions as well. So it's not just a training module that your teachers can do once. It is something they can come back and do again, over and over again. And this one is a completely rebuilt teacher course. It's a whole new content, whole new area. And that was the thinking behind that idea of having a subscription model for our teacher training, that it wouldn't be something that would be once off, that teachers did once and then they put the book away and never learnt a thing about Schoolbox again. We know that Schoolbox is a constantly changing and evolving system, so we wanted to have a training system that constantly changes and evolves as well. So we do encourage teachers to go back and redo the training and relearn new topics. There may be different ways of doing things, new concepts, and they're all communicated in that teacher training guide as well. We also, from time to time, will build specific guides for specific features, and so Pastoral's a good example of this. With the Pastoral system, it is specific to a specific group of people, so we build a specific guide for that group of people so that you can hand that out to your pastoral people to inform them of the changes. And they'll happen from time to time when a major feature has a large amount of change in it. So there's lots of documentation here about what changes are happening, what to know about, how to communicate that change. So please make use of all those resources. They're very valuable. I just wanted to bring those up. All right. A couple of other points around minimising disruption and making sure it's as minimal as possible. One of the things I do recommend is making sure you schedule the upgrade as soon as possible and start working towards that date. So as soon as we go gold, you should have in your head we're going to update to that in 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks time, and schedule that date in with us, and then work through your plan to make sure that that happens. And all of the processes need to be done before you get to that stage. Our updates themselves will be very minimally disruptive. So from a technology point of view, running an update often causes very little downtime, sometimes as little as a few minutes. Sometimes it's a bit bigger than that, depending on the size of your school and a few other things, but generally the updates themselves shouldn't cause much disruption. So really when we're talking about disruption, we are really only talking about the disruption to teachers and their expectations around how the software functions. From a technical point of view, updating should be a flick of a switch in most cases, and you shouldn't have to worry too much about it. So no scheduled downtime, although we do recommend scheduling an hour just to let people know, but there's not going to be huge extended periods of downtime. Jumping around. So, decreasing the pain. So one of the things that I recommend to remove and decrease the overall pain that you'll experience during the upgrade process is to test the beta as early as possible. Looking back at this screen here, you can see I've added in down the bottom the testing and training aspects of when you upgrade. So here now, if you look at when we actually make the 17 available, you can actually begin your beta testing as soon as we make that beta available. It can be deployed into your dev environment, and you can start that testing and process and looking at the new features and understanding the change as early as we release that beta. So that often comes out at least 1 month before we go live. So you have at least 1 month to prepare and get organized for that gold release coming out. In the case of 17, it was actually 3 months. So we had the beta out almost 3 months before because we spent a lot more time fixing issues that arose during that beta period. But we do give you plenty of time to test the beta. So please use that time to get in there and test it, make sure that you're comfortable. You've given us feedback. If there is any issues that you find, getting that feedback to us as early as possible will ensure when we do go gold, your issues that you've reported will be fixed as well. With the training, it's always good to start the training and the communication before you do the update, but the training can also continue after you've done the update. So you should be having a training plan that not just is coordinated with that update, that day that the update happens, but also following on from the update. We should have follow-up training, making sure that people are comfortable with the change, making sure that the change is still being communicated and understood throughout the whole organisation. If necessary, and you need to do training on new features or start doing training on new features, you can of course do that in the beta. So potentially you could bring your training all the way forward to in the beta period as well. So don't let that stop you. If you want to train early, use the beta. Last slide. So just on our side, I just wanted to quickly talk about something that we're looking at doing in the future to help reduce the pain of keeping up releases. Now, probably many of you in the industry have heard of the trend of continuous integration. Many common products now have gone this way. The browsers, web browsers sort of led this idea, and mobile apps were doing it for a long time. And now even Microsoft Windows has a continuous integration model. What this model does is it minimises the testing, training and change management required because releases and new features come out more frequently in smaller increments. So we can sort of minimise the amount of effort to manage the change, and so over time we can sort of fast track the releases. And so change happens gradually but constantly, rather than change happening stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. So it becomes I guess a form of constant evolution rather than a broken spacing. This model works because, well, rather than having to read that 5-page change release document every time we do a release, there might be 1 or 2 things you have to read about and learn about. So it'd be a lot easier for you to manage it. So that's why we think it's a good model to go for, because we know how intimidating our release notes can be when you see 6 months worth of our effort and work all land on your desk and you think, how am I ever going to be able to deal with all this change and communicate all this change? We understand that pain, and we think that this model will move us to a place where you won't have to have that moment of terror anymore where we do a release. Unfortunately, with this model, there's a few challenges for us internally. It's not just something we can just start tomorrow. There's a few really serious things that we need to work out before we start undertaking this type of release model. So don't expect this to happen overnight. This is just something I wanted to talk to you about, something that's coming up in our future. But the big challenges that we face is that in order to do this, we need to ensure the quality of the software with every release. So releasing a new feature, we need to make sure that that feature is 100% working every time. There will be no beta period for testing. We won't be able to work out whether there's a problem in your environment rather than in our environment. We won't have those protections of a beta testing period that we have now. And so there's much greater risk there that we release something dangerous. So we've got a few strategies to work around those problems. So I'll just talk about how we'd go about them. So firstly, we want to move towards having, I've mentioned this earlier, automated testing for everything. So we would rewrite our code so that everything can be automatically tested. So when we do a release, we have a test report that says everything in the system is working. And we do that by pressing every button and doing everything and adding every assessment and doing every possible thing in Schoolbox that possibly could be done and making sure it all worked. And we do that all automatically. And so that would be an important part of this release strategy. The next problem is, well, the feature may work for us, but it may not work for you. So how are you going to test that feature? So the way we deal with that is we put features behind feature flags. And so for every new feature that we release, rather than it just being on by default, you would turn the feature on as required. So you could go, I don't want that feature being delivered today. I'll spend a bit more time researching, developing policy, and then turn it on. Or I might turn it on in my dev server, test it out for a few weeks, and then I'll turn it on my live server. But the code on the dev and the live server will be the same. So you can turn it on and off at any time in any of those things. So we can protect you from new features being released using feature flags. And then you still maintain control of what features you get, when you want them. So rather than the system just changing underfoot under you all the time, you'll still have the ability to change when you want to change. So if we'll use feature flags to provide that power back to you. The other big challenge, of course, is how we handle custom work. With custom work, often we're integrating with the schema. We have people building reports on our database. We have a whole lot of customizations that sit and external integrations that sit and integrate with our product. Now, if our product is constantly changing and it's becoming a moving target, it's going to be very hard for any person to integrate or to maintain those integrations with our product. The way we deal with that is by having APIs that are version controlled, so that you have an API, you connect to a particular version of that API. If we change that API, we release a new version of it. So you just need to, when you're ready to update your custom report or your analytics or whatever else you've got integrated with Schoolbox, you just update to the new version of that integration. So that's how we'd manage that, change of the underlying APIs and schemas as well. So just in summary, although we're not ready for continuous integration, it is something we generally see as the direction that Schoolbox is going to head over the next few years. It's something we are investing in now to start getting and preparing for. We think it's going to help reduce the amount of workload and the amount of change management that you need to do in your school, and give you back some flexibility and power around what features go out when and how, and also give us the ability to constantly roll out updates rather than waiting for 6 months. We'll be able to turn around features in a few weeks and be much more agile, much more iterative, and be able to be much more competitive in that market as well. So that sums up my presentation today. Thank you very much. Is there any questions before I hand you over to Dwayne? Silence. This room's always good for that. All right, no questions. Excellent. So, Dwayne, I'd like to introduce Dwayne. He's going to be talking to you about...
change management.
Change management. Thank you, Dwayne.
No worries. So yes, as was said, my name is Dwayne. I'm one of the technical account managers. I know I've presented to some of you and some of you know me. To give you an idea of my background, for the last 4 years I worked within a school which implemented Schoolbox last year. One of my master's programs was focused on change management, and specifically change management within the context of schools. So we thought when talking about releases, it might be a good opportunity to also touch on some of the change management things, not just for releases, but other processes that are in there. So obviously the biggest reason for change, and schools are notorious for this, but what is the reason behind the change? A lot of teachers, a lot of school institutions, they want to remain the same. And we see this with software, we see this with many things. So that notion of the change is a diversion of where we are at. And that is really, really important and sometimes difficult to understand. So one of the best ways that I like to think about this is, just as a couple of minutes, is I want you to think about each of these different stakeholder groups and think of one word to describe how they handle change. Have a quick conversation at your table. One word to describe for each of those stakeholder groups how they handle change. Go for it. All right, so this is obviously one of those conversations that plays out no matter which department of a school you're in, where you sit within the change process. This conversation happens, and you look at the way in which different stakeholders handle change. Now, one of the interesting things is when you look at these words you use to describe, they will fall within one of these categories, and they will fall within one of these 6 categories. Obviously, the ultimate thing we want is success, and success is what we aim for in our change. But when you look at these other things, a lot of what we see from our staff are frustration, is anxiety, is confusion, and this is one of the key things. And when we look at change management, is we have to try and alleviate those stresses, those things that are there. So what I thought I would look at today is a model for managing these complex changes. And the reason why I like to use this one is because it's a very visual way of looking at, well, what's missing? Why do we not have success in our change? Because we may think we've done everything right. We may think we have everything we need to have successful change, but there could be something we're forgetting. Obviously, success is what we are aiming for, but sometimes we may miss out. So what you'll notice with this is, to manage the change, we look for 5 attributes. We look for vision, skills, incentives, resources, and an action plan. If we have all 5 of them, we get success. There are many parts to each of these, but those 5 things will help us to get success on our change. This can be small change. This could be a release of Schoolbox. The time frame that we're talking about is a matter of weeks and months. Or this can be big change. The move to continuous reporting, the move to other aspects within the school. The first one of these, and the first one that I'm looking at, is the vision. Do you have a clear vision that underpins what it is you are doing? Does everyone have a shared vision of what's going on? It's okay to be an individual driving change and have an idea of what it is you want to achieve. A lot of the times it could be executive teams that have a clear vision of where they want to go to. But does everyone in the school or does everyone in the organization share the same vision? Do they necessarily understand that vision? So getting clarity, making it clear, why are we doing this? Getting buy-in to make sure that everyone is on board helps us to understand why it is we're doing this. Software in schools is one of those things that a lot of the time it's just driven because someone has seen it. It's driven because there is a problem there. It may be a top-down approach where it's imposed from above. So how do we get a vision from those within the organization? So vision, without that, we can't even start because we don't know where we're going or why we're going there. The second are the skills. And James touched on it in regards to the teacher training or within the information. But conversations I've had over the last 2 days have looked at this notion of, do the teachers have the skills? Does the IT team have the skills? Do the people within the organization have the skills to handle the change, as well as the skills to manage what it is you are changing towards? The skills could be things in some school environments, such as basic IT literacy, so the use of devices, the use of computers. The skill could be understanding and problem solving, if we look at more complex skills. So as a school, how do we assist this? How do we help them? How do you upskill in those things that are required? From our perspective, we try and do that through things like those documents on what's changing for teachers when we release these major releases. The Schoolbox Help Teacher course was one of those things that was implemented again to support teachers through this journey on how Schoolbox can be used in their teaching and learning. As well as you have a lot of resources in your school. One of the things that I found when I was in schools was that IT, a lot of the time, was disjointed and disconnected from the education aspects of a school. So how do you get them communicating and interacting more to support this upskilling? Because there's a wealth of knowledge within an organization. How do you do it? So we move from having a clear vision, we have the skills. We then have to incentivize. And the first thing we think of when we talk about incentives is people will always go to this. There'll always be something dangling in front, something external for change. We used to see it in sales that money, commission, was the incentive that was there. Researchers found that that actually was a detractor. By having that external incentive, it didn't achieve anything. The more incentive that was there, the actual lower growth and things that changed. So we talk about this as how do we develop that intrinsic motivation, that internal incentive to get the change working. For staff, a lot of the time, the first concern is the concern for self. A staff member, when change is thrown at them, will instantly go, how is this going to affect me? That is the first question that they will ask anyone. It's the first question they will ask themselves. So this incentive, you have to find a way of incentivizing them internally to get them to not be concerned of self, but to be concerned about other things there. Time in marking. Staff are actually pretty good at going, hey, one sec, if we use this online rubric and we click across, that's going to save you time for marking. Instantly, that's actually a really, really easy sell to have online marking. Especially if you've got touch screens, it will take you 10 seconds to mark an assessment item. Click on these boxes. That incentive is not you giving something at the end of this process. That's you showing them how they can change and improve within there, giving them more time when they think about things. So by having a clear vision, having the skills, having the incentives, this gets us moving through this process. But then we look at this resource notion and the notion of, well, are we actually giving them the opportunity to do this? If you go into a school and you talk to any teacher, the one thing that they are missing is time. They will always say they are time poor. No matter who it is in the organization, it could even be IT teams, no matter who it is, they are time poor. So that resource of time is the most valuable thing that you need to look at. As you can see from this graphic in the change process, is depending on how long a change takes place, is how well it succeeds. If you're talking about major change, so you change something that you were doing in a school, it takes up to 5 years to actually see the effect of that change. A major change is not an instantaneous thing. A major change is something that takes time. If you were to take a piece of software and go, all right, guys, as of tomorrow, this is what you're doing. Or we're doing continuous reporting next week. I hope you're all ready. That's not going to make this change successful. So time as a school is the most important thing to give. Obviously, when we're talking about software, we have to resource and make sure we've got servers that are there. We have to make sure that our internet is able to handle it. But time is the most valuable resource that is there. So now we have a vision that is clear and shared. We have provided the skills for everyone within there, and they have the skills needed to handle the change and to handle the software that you're putting there. We've provided them the opportunity to develop internal motivation, internal incentives to get to that end result. We've provided the resources. And we may have done all of these things, but most places fall down with this last one, which is we don't put a plan in place. We have an idea of all of these things, we invest all of this money, but we don't put a plan in place to get to that end result. So we work through this process. We set a goal. We make a plan to get there. We do it. We make sure that we stick to our plan. And then we get to the goal. Now, this goal may be our overall vision, or it may be milestones throughout this project or throughout this change. So for a lot of schools, when they look at Schoolbox, it could be launched to teachers, launched to students, doing online assessment, opening up to parents, continuous reporting. Each of these things are a goal, making a clear plan, making the plan visible, working on it, and sticking to the plan. If you provided the resources, the skills, you'll achieve your goal because the resourcing is there. The people have the skills to make the change. So it's 5 things that we need to get success. We need a clear and shared vision. We need to have the skills to get there. We need to have the incentives. As I said, it has to be internal. We need the resources, the most valuable of which is time. We need a clear action plan, not just within one person's head, but within the entire change team. By doing that, we get success. If we look, and we look at those words you described and where they fit within those 6 options, if you are missing that vision, you get confusion. How many times when you've tried change in your school do people get confused about what is taking place? One of the biggest ones we see is anxiety for change, especially within teachers, especially when it comes to technology. Is the anxiety for the change in the technology that's there. The anxiety is a lot of the time quite valid. They could be concerned to be shown that one sec, maybe I'm not as good as these other people, that I'm lacking these skills that we've got there. Without the incentive, so why are we changing? You will get resistance because there's no value to this change. There is no incentive for them to go, all right, I'm willing to spend the time. I'm willing to do this. Without the resources, you get frustration. If you look at most change that takes place in a school, and you look at it from an IT perspective, or you look at what's being implemented, there will be frustration. And if we consider time to be one of the most critical resources we have and we give, That frustration is because they don't have time to do it. They're split across so many things that they don't have time to work on this. They may have every desire to, but they're frustrated that they can't. Without that action plan, you will have false starts. We've seen it where schools have tried to do launches to parents, and they haven't planned through that process, and so they have a false start. And they go again. But this time they put the plan in place to get to where they want to be. So it's these 5 things, and if we think through them, we can get success. As I said, this could be for a small project, or you look at it as a whole school change, or institutional change. The same 5 things will always lead to that success. And then obviously the most important thing is to celebrate the success. If you don't celebrate those small wins or what you've done or why you've got there, then you're missing out on a massive opportunity to start developing that incentive, that motivation. So celebrating the success will help you continue on the next change and the next one. So all I wanted to show was a very simple model that can be used in complex as well as minor change to help you through that process. So thank you very much. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Fantastic. Thank you very much for listening.